This is a Fedtro Hexo-Let. It's fairly interesting and unusual receptacle expander device. I just found this today while digging out some parts for an experiment, although I've had this for a couple of years. It's just a typical receptacle expander device, except the receptacle consists of a pair of long slots where a plug can be inserted anywhere along the length of the device. So especially with the slimmer plugs when this was invented, which or when this was produced, which it's out of reach. But you could potentially fit, half a dozen plugs into this thing, which, depending on what you're doing, may or may not be a problem. I mean, if you're running, say, a handful of lights or a handful of fairly small loads, not a big deal. If you're trying to run a bunch of, say, irons and, at the time, radios, because those would be fairly power hungry just by virtue of the tube construction, and heaters and stuff, it would. But then again, ideally, in a properly implemented system, it would have blown the fuse back then because they didn't really have circuit breakers in common use yet. But it's just a fairly interesting thing. Fedtro Hexo-Let. Those are the patent numbers, 110 volt to 120 volts, so I'm guessing from that it's probably from the 1950s, although it could be from the very late 1940s, or maybe even 1930s, but I kind of doubt it being that old, and Japan being the country of origin. Of course, Fedtro, model HL6, 1500 watts AC or DC, so could be a fairly old design, given that it's DC rated, although some places did have DC electricity back in the 1950s. So, yeah, 15 ampere, 110 volt to 120 volt, so it's a fairly interesting thing. And of course, by the pattern, with the mounting screw being mounted centrally between the pair of plugs on the back of the thing. This is obviously intended for use in an undergrounded receptacle, because grounded receptacles usually would be slightly offset, and the plugs would be spaced slightly to one side. And of course also it tells how old the thing is, because these are just wired in parallel. Nowadays, in modern ones of this nature, either there are two separate plugs, each of which feeds usually two gangs of 3 receptacles, just to distribute the load, or there's just one pair of actual power prongs, but 2 separate grounding prongs. I've seen both designs, and everything just runs off the top, usually receptacle. Because obviously in something like this, obviously when this was made, receptacles were designed so that it was all just one common piece of metal, and there wasn't the breakaway link that modern receptacles have, so that you can split the top and bottom receptacles into two separate circuits, or the same circuit but one of them is switched, or both of them are controlled by separate switches, or something of that nature. So that would not have been an issue back when this thing was made. Nowadays, of course, it would be. But then again, in modern grounded receptacles, you couldn't use this. And even fairly old receptacles, because old grounded ones, because the grounding requirement was in 1962, or when that came into effect.